Putin apparently is a deeply religious person. This is a Russian cathedral he's just destroyed. So it would appear Putin almost has no limits on what he's prepared to do. I think the drone attack in Moscow is very interesting and very significant. Not the first time Moscow has been attacked by drones. There is some reasonably good intelligence out there that these are the new Ukrainian long-range attack drones. They haven't done a huge amount of damage, but it's very visual. So, you know, for Muscovites on the streets can't help but notice. And I think it's significant because Muscovites seem to think that they are well out of the war, protected, and anything time something like this happens, you know, there is uproar and more pressure on Putin, who is somebody under considerable pressure at the moment. So I think this is part of the general Ukraine, what we call the deep battle. We've seen all the ammo dumps and fuel dumps being blown up in Ukraine and Belgorod and others. But this, again, I think is to unsettle Moscow, unsettle the Muscovites, who, of course, are really the key people that Putin listens to. I think it's unlikely that that the Ukrainians could create the sort of damage that we've seen by Russia in Ukraine. The drones just don't have the capability to carry that sort of explosives. I think it's very much more presentationally for people to see, and it's even now being reported, you know, in Russian news that some of these large buildings are damaged. So I think that's it. Psychologically, for the Russians, particularly the Muscovites, I expect they are hugely concerned because they probably don't realize that Ukraine cannot sort of drop buildings as Russia is doing across Ukraine itself. Attacking the cathedral, I think, is hugely significant. I mean, it is straight out of the Syrian Playbook, which I saw the Russians execute in Syria over a number of years. Because what happens with protected sites like religious sites, and particularly Odessa Cathedral is a UNESCO protected site. So the Ukrainians would have given the UN the exact grid coordinates of the cathedral so that could be given to the Russians so that they would know not to attack it, being a protected site. However, what happened in Syria with other protected sites are hospitals and schools. Whenever the hospitals I was working with moved and gave our grids to the United Nations, almost the next day we got a Russian missile through the buildings. And that would appear to be what happens here. You know, there is no excuse that they didn't mean to hit this cathedral. You know, it's a massive place. Putin apparently is a deeply religious person. This is a Russian cathedral he's just destroyed. So, and it would have required his say-so to attack it. So deeply cynical, and just goes on to the, you know, when we're considering where next, well, it would appear Putin almost has, you know, no limits on what he's prepared to do. And I think the cathedral strike is very significant. I think it's more desperation, actually. You know, Putin and the Russians are really running out of road, and it's some bizarre thing. They think if they take out buildings like cathedrals and destroy grain, it's going to make the Ukrainians sort of surrender and capitulate. Well, actually, we've seen over the last 14 months, it does exactly the opposite and strengthen them. Under the Geneva Convention, religious sites like churches and synagogues and mosques are protected sites, as are hospitals and schools. They are not legitimate targets. And the sort of rules of war drawn up back in, you know, the early part of last century detail that opposing sides would inform the United Nations, who would then inform the other side exactly where these sites are, so they wouldn't be attacked. Also, you add to that industrial sites that could cause danger, like big chemical factories. But what we saw in Syria, what I saw from 2013 and latterly 2016, 17, when the Russians came in, actually they used that information for what we call precision targeting. So if the Ukrainians are giving the exact, what we call a 10-figure grid reference, which really goes right down to a sort of meter square, you know, the Russians would then appear to be typing that grid into their precision-guided computers so that the missile lands exactly on it. And we saw that frequently in Syria. And all complain. Unfortunately, the UN are pretty pretty ineffective in policing this. They're just sort of following the rules when one explains it. But it happened time and time again, and it would appear to be happening in Ukraine as well. Although it's not significant in its size of a town, but it's become strategically, politically hugely significant. And I think the Wagner Group are key to that. So the Wagner Group, the most effective part of the Russian army until Prigozhin mutineered a few weeks ago, fought for 9 or 10 months around Bakhmut very heavily, took huge amounts of casualties for really, inches gained. But what we've seen over the last few weeks, and particularly over the last weekend, is Ukrainian forces making considerable progress. There was even some talk yesterday that the Ukrainian flag was up in the middle of Bakhmut. That is yet to be confirmed. But again, reports today that Ukraine forces have taken another couple of square miles around Bakhmut. And it would seem reasonable to expect in the next few days that they will retake it, which will be a tremendous blow to the Russian forces, particularly Wagner, who that was their Waterloo, and it's now been, they probably perceive, given up relatively cheaply by the Russian forces who replace them. Lukashenko, like he is acting a bit like some overgrown buffoon at the moment, and going to St. Petersburg to see Putin, claiming that Wagner are out of control and are going to attack Poland. Well, I expect Wagner are pretty cross at the moment. We haven't heard from Prigozhin for a while and what he's doing. The thought of them attacking into Poland is just crazy. Even Lukashenko might not realize it, but Putin realizes, one Russian or Belarusian toe in Poland brings the weight of NATO into this conflict. And as we're aware, NATO is 5 times more powerful than Russia. Things would be over pretty quickly, and I think Putin knows that. I expect Wagner are probably terrifying Lukashenko a little bit, what they're going to do, and what are Prigozhin's aims. It's almost more likely that Wagner and Prigozhin will kick Lukashenko out of Belarus, or even use it as a staging post to go east, not west. So again, I think it's all part of the noise that we've become very familiar with in this conflict of disinformation and propaganda. And Lukashenko, I just don't think is a reliable figure. One other piece that we learned over the weekend is that Ukraine is now using cluster munitions on the Russian trenches. Although we've discussed in great detail the legality of these things, actually, for what the Ukrainians are using them for, should be highly effective, further sapping the morale of those poor Russian conscripts sat in these trenches. And I think it's not a coincidence that we're hearing a few breakthroughs, because not only will those cluster munitions have a major impact on the personnel manning those trenches, they also help to set off a lot of the mines by their sort of combustion charges. So that will make things easier. So significant, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of their use on the front line over the next few days and weeks.